Now, what I want to do is I want to talk about the impulse reflexes or the responses have possibly shown up in the dominant community. And what I want to do is I want to talk about them in the wake of in some of the recent events that have taken place. So Janina Fisher has a really good handout that goes through the different states, right? There's five. Technically, there's you could say that there's six, but you have fight, flight, freeze, attach, and submit. Here's what I think may have happened for those in the dominant group from a neurological perspective. I'll just take the example of George Floyd. The George Floyd death was unbelievably traumatic for those of us in the Black community. But I also, again, both and, right? When we're integrated, we can think and feel. We do a both and. The and to that is that it was extraordinarily traumatizing on different levels for those in the dominant community as well. And as a result, now let's bring in the impulse states. I think many in the dominant group, there was this freeze moment. I think it was a moment of shock for many in the dominant group. You might even remember where you were when you saw the video. It's kind of like 9/11. Everyone remembers where they were when they saw the planes crash into the towers. I'll never forget where I was my senior year in high school, right? Same thing with the Floyd video. There was this freeze. Didn't know what to do. It was a moment of like I paralyzed. And then I think for others, there was this flight. My wife was telling me about someone who had kids in the room, which might have been actually a good idea to turn the TV off. Others of us might say, no, it was good for them to see that. Regardless, there was this flight, right? I need to get out of here. I need to get away from the TV. I need to shut everything out. I need to get away from the madness. I need to withdraw. And so you find this flight for a lot of people because it's almost kind of like putting your head in the sand or plugging your ears. It was too much and people had to get away from it. Then you had fight. And I think with fight, there was actually two ways that fight came out. There was a fight in terms of, I'm going to fight. Maybe you were somebody who was going to put on a Black Lives Matter and not to get too much into that, but you were going to show your support to those in the Black community some way or another. You're going to speak out. You're going to use your voice. And it was one of those moments where I'm going to fight for a people group that belonged to a man who was murdered on TV. And now you're connected to this larger narrative and you say, oh my goodness, this is a problem. And that fight impulse kicked in. But it also may have kicked in the other way, where it was, again, remember how in the dominant group, you don't want to get suckered. I think there was another fight impulse that said, wait a minute, this is a liberal agenda. This is a XYZ. You know where I'm going with that, right? Again, forget about the political piece. But notice that fight, which was, I'm fighting against this. I think there's misinformation. I don't want to be duped. I don't want to be finessed. I think a lot of people are getting hacked. I think COVID's got, and there's this, and look at the protests and look at the damage that's coming. And again, there was this other mechanism that kicked in for many people in the dominant group, which actually caused an inner collision within the dominant group. Right? You had those in the dominant group who were both fighting, but then there became a clash between one another, all within the dominant group about what was happening in the minority group. Then you have attach. And again, attach is when we are seeking proximity. You start to see proximity seeking behaviors. When it happened, right? After George Floyd was murdered, I had many people, and I mean many people in the dominant group contact me. Really, some of them to just see how I was doing, how I was feeling, but many people in the dominant group started offering up a wealth of apologies. And there was this moment, again, watershed moment where it was kind of like, okay, oh my, I had no idea. And I put some content out there to kind of let people know how vulnerable I was feeling as well. But again, there was this attach mechanism that we saw. I want to say that can play out in a couple different ways. We can attach out of anxiety, which is what this is, or we can attach out of security or in a healthy sense. The attachment that happened after George Floyd, you'll notice that a lot of it was anxiety based. And then you have submit. Submit is when, in a different context, submit is when we have an overwhelming situation and you start to find that people sort of implode or they collapse. Really, it's resignation. I think in the dominant group, there are a fair bit of folks in this category of submit, where it's just kind of like, okay, whatever. You're right and you're right. I don't really care. It doesn't really matter. I don't really want to argue. I don't have the energy. We've been through COVID. I don't want to do this. And there's this submit of, you know what? I'll just be overly agreeable. I don't really have a stance. I'm neutral, right? And we get neutral energy from some of those folks who submit because that's part of that adaptation. That's part of that stress response to a situation, to trauma. So again, I think when we look at how the brain works, again, you have the thalamus that brings in the information. You have the amygdala that determines the emotional significance. And then at that point, depending on how the amygdala determines the significance is whether it goes to the part of the brain that can think and provide the thinking that balances the feeling, or if it just goes right on down into the impulse state, right? It activates our autonomic response system and we just freak out, or we do one of these things that we see in terms of impulse state.